He, from a very early age, loved to read. He also said he knew from a very early age that what he wanted to do was write stories. And but then the family moved back after, I don't know how many years they lived there. He didn't mention the interview, but then they moved back to Argentina, and that's where he completed his education. He did his undergraduate degree. And as he says, I've always been an academic. My area of interest is comparative literature. So he was literature and writing, stories was always his thing. But what is so, that I found so interesting is that, so his mother tongue is Spanish. Then he grew up spent his childhood years in Sweden, where he had to learn Swedish and went to school in Swedish. And Swedish and Spanish are not at all, similar languages. And then when he was back in Argentina, he won a scholarship to complete, I think it was his PhD in New York City at NYU. So and in the meanwhile, he said, he fell in love, and I thought this was an interesting expression, with the English language. So he writes his fiction in English, which is pretty impressive. And if you read the book, I mean, this is not just, basic English. This is a real skill with language, as well as, of course, I guess that comes with the fact. So he is a professor, I believe now, of literature. I'm not sure what his area is, at Columbia University. And but
he's a professor at Columbia University.
Yeah. So, which it reminded me, because it's like he had to fall in love with the English language. Like it's sort of, I don't know, I thought he was a little bit. It made me think there's a writer, Jhumpa Lahiri, who wrote a book about that she fell in love with Italian. And he wrote this beautiful little book about, and moved her family to Rome, and he still lives there. And she grew up, the family was of Indian origin, but English, I think, was her, at least her language of education. She fell in love with the Italian language. The Italian language I could see falling in love with, right? It sounds very beautiful, and it's, but she just, so to me, I kept thinking about her. And then anyways, but he said that and why English, you would ask to yourself, and this I thought was very interesting. He said because English has a, how does he word it? He finds it a very stimulating language. And he says, because of its lexical wealth and its dual register of Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and Latin. So it's true, English is a very large language. When you look at the English dictionary, and I'm constantly looking up words, my memory is not so good. I look them up and forget them, and then have to look them up again. But I can read articles in magazines and newspapers and not know words. And I remember years ago, a friend of mine who was in Switzerland said to me, why do you need to use a dictionary when English is your mother tongue? Why are you looking up words? And I said, because there's so many words I don't know in the English language. Don't you look up words in German? And she said, no, I don't. There's like a certain amount of words. I know them all. I mean, German words are very long because they have these compact words, right? They put the 3 words together to make something. She said, I don't have to do that. And when you look at the dictionary, which is also fascinating reading, I find, you see that the origins, English is such a composite of languages, of all different origins. So this is what he said. This is what attracted him to the English language. As we said, it's lexical wealth, and it's combination, because it's such a combination of many languages. The words have, when you look them up in the dictionary, this comes from the Latin that, or this comes from the Germanic that, or this comes from the, whatever. So that's what he writes in English. And it's pretty impressive that, for this, his 3rd language, that he writes with such skill, real skill and craftsmanship. Whether you like the book or not, could get through it, understood what was going on, because it's not a simple story. But it's still, you have to appreciate his use of language, that he really has a very large vocabulary, and he really uses it. So he says that's it. English is the language that stimulates him to want to write. And so what does he do? He's in his, I would say his late 40s, but I'm not sure exactly about when he was born. He lives in New York City now. He said he's a professor at university in New York. And he's only his second novel. So his first novel is called In the Distance. And it was set in the 1920s. Did it? Nobody. I don't know. Gold Rush. Does that sound familiar? During the Gold Rush, that's when he said it, because he said that period of American history fascinates him, the 20s and especially the 20s and 30s. So he says this book is also, that's the time period. I mean, it's actually the early 20th century, and the main part of it are in the 1920s, maybe early 30s. But it's set in New York City and in a sanatorium in Switzerland. And there are so many literary references in this book. I guess the more you know about literature and the more you read, the more you get the references. For example, I don't know if anybody read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. I never read it, but I remember my late mother who studied literature with all Thomas Mann's. She read it in the original version. And the Magic Mountain. So the Magic Mountain, it takes place in a TV sanatorium in the mountains in Switzerland. So part of this book, as you know, takes place in the sanatorium in Switzerland. And there are a lot of references. You know the Magic Mountain, because I went to look up the story, and you'll see the parallels of the characters in Magic Mountain and in Trust here. There are also references to Zelda Fitzgerald. Did anybody know Zelda F. Fitzgerald, its writer, and his wife Zelda, who was famous for a brief period of time in her own right, also wrote, but she was quite an interesting figure. So there are a lot. I mean, you read the book, like Zelda references to the character in the book. But how does he set it up? So there was another reference that I didn't understand that I had to look up. There's something that one of the reviews said, and Hernan Diaz sets up this book, Trust, in he uses the Rashomon effect in storytelling. So what is the Rashomon effect? I heard of it, I'm ignorant, but it is named after a Japanese film from the 1950s that was called Rashomon. But what it is, if you ever hear this expression again, no, the Rashomon effect refers to a storytelling and writing method, which is used in cinema very often, but he uses it in this book, in which an event is given contradictory interpretation. So there is one effect, and then there are different interpretations or descriptions given by the individuals involved, which provide different perspectives and points of view for the same event. And that's what he does here in this book. So I didn't know the term Rashomon. That is one word, Rashomon. Rashomon. And it's a capital because it was named after the title of the film. You remember the film? It's pronounced Rashomon. Rashomon. Okay, sorry, Rashomon. I don't know. Japanese. It's a Japanese word. Rashomon. So do you remember the film? Do you remember the idea of I don't remember the film, but I remember that there was something. I actually remember okay, so it was this nice when you said it Rashomon the film by a filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, which if you're a film person, you'll know that, and in which a murder is described in four contradictory ways by four different witnesses. So this term is now used to address the motive and mechanism and occurrences of reporting on the circumstance and of the same effect. So yeah, when was that? 1950. 1950. Yeah, so they probably used it I'm sure, yeah, and you look it up on YouTube, that this is probably a classic, and I say, if you're a film buff, then you would know about this. But it's kind of, so somehow that became, instead of saying, oh, the story is told from 4 different perspectives, it sounds much, fancier to say, oh, and the author uses the rational method. So I put the emphasis on the great syllable effect in the story. So it's a little bit like you start the book. It's very interesting. So you have the title page, and then you have content. You have to look at this table of contents here. Okay, so what's in this? Because it tells you something. So the contents are 4 different sections when you just look at the table of contents. The first one is called Bonds by a person, and under is written Harold Van. Then the second section is called My Life by an Andrew Bevel. The third section is called A Memoir Remembered by an Ida Partenza. And the last section is called Futures by Mildred Bevel. So you have Andrew and Mildred Bevel writing the second and fourth sections of the book, and 2 other people. You don't know who anybody is, obviously. Then you open up the first section, and there is a title page of it, and it says Bonds, a novel, Harold Van. So it's a novel within a novel. So you open it up and you start reading, and you read this story. And what's the story about? It's about a man called Benjamin Bass, and he grows up in a very wealthy family, great privilege, and there's a brief history of this family, of Benjamin's forefathers and how they became so wealthy. And so how does the author start writing? And it's so interesting because he has 4 different sections, each section told by a different person in a different voice, with also, it turns out, a different, so the first section is, as I said, when you look it up, it's labeled Bond a Novel. Then you'll read that part. Then you go to the second one, and it'll tell you what it is. It's My Life by Andrew Bevel, and there are contents, again, table of content, and it turns out that, so this is written by somebody else. Then the third one is a memoir. So you have the first one of the 4 parts is billed as a novel. The second is My Life, with its table of content, is kind of an autobiography, but sketches of an autobiography when you read it. It's a bit odd, and it's, there are paragraphs, and then there are just these notes. So this Andrew Bevel is going to write his autobiography, but they're also, he's not right. It doesn't have the same complete feel as the novel that's written as a novel of the first part. It's as if he's jotting down ideas of how, and then he's going to fill them in later and write his autobiography, whoever this Andrew Bevel is. Then the third part is billed as a memoir revisited, and we have a woman writing that. The first 2 sections are written by men, and then Ida Partenza, whoever she's going to be, is writing a memoir revisited, whatever that's supposed to be. And the final section, the shorter one, called Futures, which is an ironic title, is written by Mildred Bevel, who is the wife, we find out, of the Andrew Bevel, the second part, who is in a sanatorium in Switzerland, and she is very, very ill, and she knows that she is not going to have any future, but her section of the book is called Futures. Just as the novel is called Bonds. And what's this? These are play on words, words that they can have double meanings, because the book is very much about American capitalism, that, the rise of the capitalism that has fueled America's growth, the system of capitalism that gave rise to the wealth and to the success of contemporary, not America, such an old country, but of modern America. So there are all these financial terms that are used throughout the book, but bonds and futures can be used as their financial instruments, as well as they can be bonds, all kinds of bonds, emotional bonds, connection, and that, yeah, and futures are futures in the financial curve, except that this woman, like she's, by the time she's writing it, is dying in a sanatorium in Switzerland. And so anyway, so that's, so the first, so it's very, you read the first part and you think, okay, and if you don't pay too much attention to the fact that it says bonds, a novel, you read it and you learn about this person, Benjamin Rath, who grows up in a very wealthy family. His great-grandfather and his grandfather and his father, they all made a lot of money. So he comes into this inherited money, but he seems to be very skilled also at continuing the family fortune. He's very good at playing the stock market, or part of the stock market, the financial world, and he does very, very well. He's an only child, we find out. His father had died when he was young, and he goes, and he's an odd character. He's fabulously wealthy because of this inherited wealth, and he's continued to grow his family money, but he doesn't really have any appetites for things like the wealth that he has that could buy him, and he buys himself a mansion, he builds himself a mansion on the Upper East Side, I think it is, and furnishes it, and does all the things that are expected of a man of such wealth, but he doesn't have a passion for it. The only thing that he really seems to have a passion for is the market and money and finance and how, and it's a game, it's a puzzle. So that's what he does. And he marries this woman. He finds a woman who is an only child, who's been educated in Europe, a strange upbringing, with a father who it seems is very he's odd at the beginning, and he devotes his life to his only daughter's education. So this, and the woman's name is Helen in the novel, in the fictitious story of the first part. And Benjamin marries her because he sees in her a kind of kindred spirit. She too is not part of, she doesn't have the same kind of interests or appetites as one would expect from a girl from a wealthy family. She comes from a family, an old money family in Albany. And except that the family wasn't as financially savvy as this Benjamin's family, and they're living on pretense and show, which is why her parents take her to Europe when she's a young girl, because they can kind of pretend to live on less money there and still pretend to live the same kind of high society life that they can no longer keep up so well in America. She comes back to the States, Benjamin meets her, and they get married. It's an interesting arrangement. They have no children. He seems to adore her. We don't know very much about her. She becomes sickly, and he takes her to a sanatorium. This is the novel story. Takes her to a sanatorium in Switzerland, and it's not a TB sanatorium, or it's not a sanatorium for physical diseases. It's a mental health for people, wealthy people who suffer from various mental health issues. So that's where, and she slowly deteriorates into madness. And at the end of that novel, first section of the book, she dies and her husband is bereft. And meanwhile, she has become interested and become a patron of culture and great philanthropic. She supports orchestras and ballet and theater and libraries, and that's what she does. So it's a very, it's just, this couple is described, and this is the first part of the book. So, but and then it ends. And it ends, and it's a pretty big section. It's about 125 pages of the book. And after his wife dies, Benjamin kind of retreats into himself. He goes and he just continues to work and keep making money, because this money and the market is a game to him, and he's very good at this game. And even in the stock market crash of 1929, and this is one of the little events of the book, he doesn't lose money. He still somehow manages when the whole country, everybody, most people lose everything, anyone who was involved in the market, and then it leads to the Great Depression of the 30s. But he comes out unscathed, and rumors start to circulate about him that what was he doing? He must have been doing something not kosher, legal, if he was able to still continue accumulating his wealth after the great crash of 1929. So just a way to give you an example of the way the first section is written, how Diaz writes, he's describing this Benjamin, and the year at this point is 1914. And so remember, this is the beginning of, over 100 years ago, when America is really just, the capitalist system is really getting started. So back home, Benjamin, because he was talking about Europe, because he's also going to invest in Europe, he sends one of his trusted employees to finalize deals with German banks, and Swiss pharmaceutical companies, and they have dealings in Zurich and all around Europe. But back home, Benjamin grasped, directed his attention to the tangible foundations of his wealth, things and people, which the conflict had merged into one single machine, because we're talking 1914, so it's the beginning of the Great War, World War I. He invested in sectors related to the war, from mining and steelmaking to munitions manufacturing and shipbuilding. He became interested in aviation, in the commercial potential airplanes would have in times of peace. Fascinated by the technological advancements that defined those years, he funded chemical companies and financed engineering ventures, patenting many of the invisible parts and fluids in the new engines driving the world's industry. This is an interesting way of his description of how the world was becoming more and more industrialized. Yeah, the Industrial Revolution was the previous century, but things are changing rapidly. And through his proxies in Europe, Benjamin negotiated bonds, and here you have this word bond in the financial term, issued from every nation involved in the war. Yet, despite how formidable his wealth had become, this was only the starting point of his true ascent. His reticence increased with his reach. The further and deeper his investment extended into society, the more he withdrew into himself. It seems that the virtually endless mediations that constitute a fortune, equities and bonds, tied to corporations, tied to land and equipment and laboring multitudes, housed, fed, and flowed through the labor of yet other multitudes around the world. This is Diaz talking about how he pictures capitalism, that's one of his main themes, around the world, paid in different currencies with a value, also the object of trade and speculation, tied to the fate of different national economies, tied ultimately to corporations, tied to equities and bonds, had rendered immediate relationships irrelevant. So this is a sense. But here you have this idea of bonds. So the bonds in the financial sense is what he is preoccupied with and fascinated with. But in immediate relationships, he doesn't have those kinds of bonds. Still, as he reached and passed what he thought was the midpoint of his life, a dim sense of genealogical responsibility, together with an even vaguer notion of propriety, made him consider marriage. That's all he needed. So this is before he's married. All this, so then, and then in the second set, that was the first section of this novel. And then he's going to meet the woman, Helen, who he's going to marry, and then this novel continues, and their life together. It's described her philanthropic venture. She becomes ill, and she's unable to go out of the house, where she has concerts and recitals and readings brought to her mansion, and she starts this whole philanthropic interest of hers, which she continued. And then eventually she sadly ends her life. Again, this is a novel section of the book, in this clinic in Switzerland, where she is subjected to, and their description of, these early versions of electroshock therapy. Because anyway, this is a fancy Swiss clinic, and the doctors there are supposedly, top doctors in the world, and you have that kind of money, as Benjamin Raskin's husband clearly do. This is where you go, and so she is subjected to horrible treatment, and that's where she died.
And it wasn't that sanatorium that wanted to give it to the doctor there that was in charge of her on a different method, and her husband brought in some.
Yes, right. He didn't agree with the method, right?
Who did the
Who did. So, yeah, so he had his strong opinions, and he had so much money that he could control and buy out, he didn't agree, a pharmaceutical company, or he could get a scientist, articles not published in journals. Like it showed how he could destroy. I mean, does he ultimately destroy his wife? Is he responsible for her? But in the meanwhile, he can wreak all kinds of damage on wherever he wants to because of his money. So, right, so he does, his wife dies, and then he is, he's bereft, and he goes back to America, and he goes back to New York, and he goes back to his house, and but he continues to do his financial dealings and to maintain his financial empire, but from his house, and he becomes a kind of recluse, and once his beloved wife has died. That's the first chapter. I mean, the first section of the book. And then you get this next section, which is the outlines of a memoir that's called My Life by Andrew Beckel, who it seems like when you start to read it, you think, wait a minute, this is the real life version, the autobiography of the man who the novel of the first section was based on, because the first section is billed as a novel. And when you go through his autobiographical notes, writings, then you realize, yeah, there are definitely similarities. So the novel was based on, but why? And why is he showing this to us? And who is the author of the novel of the first part, this Harold Bell? Like, where does he come from? And so it's very odd. And why is he writing this autobiography? And it turns out that he's writing it because he's very upset that whoever this Harold Becker character was wrote a novel that was completely based on his life and his late wife's life, and he's very, very upset, and he wants to set the record straight. And even though the first part is only a novel, still, people read novels, and even though they know it's only fiction, and that's something one can discuss, that even if it's written clearly a novel, which often you find on books, and you notice, just to make sure that that this is not a memoir or an autobiography, they can still do damage because people read novels and they know back to something, and then they'll say, oh, so this Andrew Bevel, who is the real name of the character upon which the whole first section of the book is based. And why, if you think of it, why is the novel section put at the beginning of the book? Like, it's first the novel is published, and then the person, the man on whose life the novel was clearly based, decides to tell his part of the story and set the record straight. And so he begins in his preface to his section, my name is known to many, my deeds to some, my life to few. This has never concerned me much. What matters is the tally of our accomplishments, not the tapes about us. Still, because my past has so often overlapped with that of our nation, a very prominent financier, lately I have come to believe that I owe it to the public to share some of the decisive moments of my story. So that's what he's going to be doing. He's going to be setting the record straight. I cannot say, in all honesty, that I am writing these pages in order to indulge the desire, so frequent in men my age, to talk about myself in life. Over the years, I have been loath to make statements of any kind. This ought to be proof enough that I have never been inclined to discuss my doings out in the open. Rumors have surrounded me most of my life. I have grown accustomed to them and take care never to deny gossip and tape. Denial is always a form of confirmation. So, so I kind of to other people. People write novels about you, don't bother to deny them. That means that you're just admitting guilt, or you're confirming that some of this stuff might be true in some way. Yet, I confess the urge to address and refute some of these fictions, and it has become pressing, especially since the passing of my beloved wife, Mildred. Mildred was the quiet, steady presence in my life that made so many of my achievements possible. I take it to be my duty to ensure that her memory does not fade and her classic moral example endures through time. I offer here my wife's loving portrait, resigned to knowing that it should fail to fully honor her dignity, candor, and grace. So he's writing this as a tribute to his wife, because that novel, written by that man, Harold Banner, whoever he is, and we find out at the end of the book who he was, besmirched his wife's legacy. So he, the real Andrew Bevel, who until now has never denied any rumors, he hasn't bothered to. The fact would just give credence to these rumors and nonsense that people, and gossip that people write. He doesn't do it. Now that it's his wife's reputation, his beloved late wife, okay, so he's going to write something to deny and present the real story. And he says, my hope is that these pages will serve as a reminder of the unflagging boldness that has hitherto defined our people, meaning that Americans, and how, because he's a great American patriot, he's a great proponent, obviously, of the financial system, the capital system that made America so great. He says, I know that the days ahead of me are fewer than those I have left behind. There is no escaping the most basic fact of this accounting. A certain amount of time is allotted to each of us. Only how much, only God knows. We cannot invest it. We cannot hope for a return of any kind. All we can do is spend it, meaning our time on earth, second by second, decade by decade, until it runs out. Still, even if our days on this earth are limited, we can always, through toil and industry, hope to extend our influence into the future. And again, he's always got things with bonds and futures and investments. And so it is that, having lived my life with an eye set on posterity in the hopes of improving the lives of later generations, so he really believes that as a financier and as a capitalist par excellence and an investor, he drives the motor that makes America great. And he hopes that he's going to, and he really believes that he's improved the lives of fellow countrymen and hopes to improving the lives of later generations. So I enter these remaining years of mine, not with nostalgia for all that is gone, but with a sense of excitement for what is yet to come. And he's writing this in July of 1938. And then he writes about what really happened. And he writes it, as I said, there are paragraphs, and then there are just sentences, and then there are fragments of sentences where that it's meant to be filled in at some point in time. His autobiography. He has chapter headings, but it's a tribute to his wife, Mildred, how wonderful she was. And then he talks about her illness. But in his version of it, her illness is not mental illness in any way. It's physical illness. He doesn't give it a name at the beginning because it first manifests itself as a great tiredness and exhaustion that would never that would never get better, even bed rest and a fortified diet. And don't forget, this book is written in the style of the time. So if he's writing it in 1938, it's written in a certain language. The parts that are written in 1914 or 1920 are also written in that style of the time. So he's a master of languages, Hernan Diaz. So he starts explaining that my wife was so physically frail, and she would go out, we started to hold concerts and performances, and then she started to give money and donate to the symphony and to the harmonic and to the opera and stuff. And he has at one point, and this is what Diaz, one of the main things that he's writing in this section, written as the autobiography by the financier Andrew Bevel, not in the novel first part. He says, the market is always right, which is the belief of free market economics. So if you know anything about economics, and all that, I don't remember any of this. And in fact, in one of the interviews, what the interviewer said, there's so much about finance here, and it's language is very, if you don't know the world of finance. And the author said, I knew not, he's asked, did you have to do a lot of research for this book? And he said, yes, lots of research, because I come from academia, my field is comparative literature. I did not know anything about the world of finance. So when we decided that this was going to be the topic of this book, I had to do a lot of research. And he said, and on purpose, because I was reading it thinking, should I really look into economics and finance and try and understand what he's talking about when he's talking about the way the market works? But Diaz said he made it on purpose. He used arcane language because he said and this is his own personal opinion, looking at it from an outsider in the world of literature, academia, he said money is an interesting thing. It's what makes the world go round, especially in a capitalist economy. But it's something that has become kind of taboo to talk about. And there's a whole arcane language around money. So if you're in the business, then you know what all these terms mean. If you're not, you can try, you can read the newspapers and you can educate yourself to a certain extent, but there's a whole complicated language around it. So he does it on purpose. So if you read the book and thought, I don't understand what all this means and the whole machinations of the world of finance and the stock market and and what's also so interesting is he's writing about the stock market in the 20s, when you actually had ticker tape and when every end of markets, and there was somebody at the financial, at the stock market, at the stock exchange, transcribing prices, but there was always, and this comes to the importance in the book, there was always a gap between, let's say, when the market closed and what the prices were then, and when it opened again in the morning, which is very important for trading. And trading, and I don't really understand any of this, but obviously if there's price differentials, and if you're trading and selling and buying, and that the futures are, and that's what short selling is, and all this stuff. So he says, yes, I made it so that I wanted to show the complexities of the market and how most people don't really have an idea what's going on. If you're an insider, yes, but most people don't. So he says here, the market is always right, says our Andrew Bevel. Those who try to control it never are. Yet during the second half of the 1920s, at the height of America's hard-earned and legitimate success, two misguided forces burst onto the scene with the intention of doing just that, meaning trying to control the market. On the one hand, in and out speculators and buccaneers looking to make a quick dollar by ruthlessly inflating prices on borrowed money. They were one of the forces trying to regulate the market. On the other, the blundering machine of the Federal Reserve, inefficiently trying to curb those gamblers through artificial, ill-conceived, poorly timed actions that only managed to hurt legitimate investors. Together, these greedy amateurs and bungling bureaucrats eventually would manage to wreck the prosperity market. The events that led to the debacle of 1929 were nothing but the perversion of everything that was great during the preceding year. So this is his point of view as as capital and the free market. And it turns out, to listen to enough interviews with Hernan Diaz, he's not a fan of, like, he's writing about this from his negative point of view. So this is what he explains, and then he ends it. It's not such a long section, it's about 60 pages long. He's got these long paragraphs, and then he's got these bits and pieces here. And he ends the last bit of his part, his notes towards an autobiography is, every single one of our acts is ruled by the laws of the economy. When we first wake up in the morning, we trade rest for profit. When we go to bed at night, we give up potentially profitable hours to renew our strength. This is how he is, voicing whether when you're tired, you go to bed, and then when you wake up in the morning, you're rested. But he translates it into motives for profit or loss. Like, how many hours of sleep would I need and hours of otherwise productive work should I give up in order to refresh myself so that I'll be more productive the next day? Like, this is what the kind of mind that he has. And throughout our day, we engage in countless transactions. Each time we find a way to minimize our effort and increase our gain. Like, this is economics 101. We are making a business deal, even if it is with ourselves. These negotiations are so ingrained in our routine that they are barely noticeable. But the truth is that our existence revolves around profit. All of us aspire to greater wealth. The reason for this is simple and can be found in science, because nothing in nature is stable. One cannot merely keep what one has. Just like all other living creatures, we either thrive or fade. It's the fundamental law governing the entire realm of life, and it is out of the instinct of survival that all men desire. Oh, yes, right, okay. And all men desire, and then you're reading it, and that's the end. Like, the rest of the sentence is not there. All men desire, and then you have a few notes here. Philosophical Testament, Gospel of Wealth, and that ends. So notes, like, very, yeah.
According to where I'm getting at it, this is breaking the finances and metaphor for living.
Yeah, definitely. So, and that ends his session. So here's his autobiography, or beginnings of autobiography, notes towards it, that is supposed to counteract the slanderous lies of the novel of the first part. Okay, then the second part, the third part, is called a memoir. I mean, the other one was kind of a autobiography, but it wasn't billed as that. A memoir, remembered by somebody called Ida Partenza. Who is Ida Partenza? This woman. So it turns out, and she writes it, she introduces herself, which she's a 70-year-old woman in the present part of what she's writing. And she tells us that 50 years earlier, almost 50 years earlier, she was desperately looking for a job. She was a young girl in her early 20s, daughter of an Italian immigrant. Her mother died in childbirth with the next sibling. And she grew up with this father who was this crazy, like really crazy Italian anarchist who's come from, I don't know, Calabria or somewhere in Italy. And she lives in Brooklyn with this father, who is a typesetter, a print setter, who was very skilled with that, who made beautiful invitations and set, doing his typesetting very beautifully. But he was an anarchist, and his whole passion was printing flyers, supporting his anarchic causes. Very anti-American. I mean, no, he came from poverty in Italy to America, but he brought his anarchy with it. So this Ida is his only daughter, and she lives with this crazy father, and she has to keep house for him. She's had to keep house for him from the age of 8 years old when her mother died. And she also has to try and figure out how to make some money because her father is so busy with his anarchic schemes that he doesn't really make enough money in doing his typesetting business, which he should be doing. So she finds herself one day lined up. There was a job advertised to be the secretary of a very wealthy man. And it turns out that this very wealthy man is none other than this Andrew Bevel. And so we get her, and her part is very, she writes it from her point of view. So we get, this is the third point of view now. First, you got the fictitious point of view, but not. Then you got the character himself, writing his memoir, except of course, do we believe it? Is he a reliable narrator? I'm just because it's his story and he's telling you this is the truth and I'm telling my story. Does that mean he's really telling the truth? By the end of the book, but the third section, so then we meet this Ida, who's this young, who's now, as I say, she's just turned 70 years old. And how does this section start? She said she was walking on the Upper East Side and she read articles. She's become a successful writer. She has had a career as a writer. And she reads that this mansion on 87th Street near Fifth Avenue on the Upper East Side has now been turned into a museum. And it is the house of the late Andrew Bevel and his late wife, Mildred. And so and it houses their papers, all their private documents, and it's beautiful, and you could come and see it. Like if you go to New York, if you have this mansion or that mansion, you can go and live and practically where people live there. So she goes, and then she starts to tell us the story of what her connection was. And it turns out that she has this brief stint. She gets hired because her skills impress this Andrew Bevel, and she gets hired to put together, to really write properly, his autobiography, which he wants to use to refute the slander that is Harold Banner, who wrote the novel, which turned out to be a best-selling novel, wants to counteract that. So she has these strange meetings with him where he tells her the story, basically tells her this is what you have to write. And there's an odd relationship going on, but what if she, he needs the money and she's a young woman and this is her first job. And it really does get her writing career started. And she, and it's the depression after, and she goes on to be from what we can get her successful writer. So her section is, and she calls it a memoir, remembered. So it's as if she's remembering his memoir, right? So that's what that is. And meanwhile, it also has the feel, those of you who read it, it's the feel of she becomes a detective. Well, not becomes a detective. She becomes involved in a bit of the shady underworld. And she's a detective in a way because she's trying to piece together this story and write it. And she is a very interesting voice. She has and then she has this crazy father, and then she has a boyfriend, and she thinks who also is an aspiring writer, and she thinks steals the pages of work that she wrote. And at the end of it, he tells her what to write. This is what my wife was like, and this is what she did, and this is what you're going to write. And then what happens is he has a heart attack. Andrew Bevel has a heart attack, and that's the end of her job. Well, that's the end of her job, is writing his memoir, because he dies and they can't have any more meetings and he can't tell her anymore what to write. But his secretary or his assistant realizes how talented and intelligent she is, and he hires her. And so she works for him a little longer, and then she embarks on her writing career for different magazines and articles for the New Yorker. And by the time we meet her, it's in 1981, is that section. And she's telling us, and she goes, and yet at the end of it, she goes to the match, goes inside, and she goes upstairs, and there's the library. And she asks if she can see, who's interested in really the papers of this Andrew Bevel, but his late wife, Mildred. And her curiosity is being piqued by the story of the wife, because the wife is so, Andrew talks about it, he idealized his beloved late wife, and he tells Ida, the scribe, about his wife, but there's something just a little bit odd about the story, and something is missing. And even in the house, she used to go to that house. That's why for her, the fact that it's now a museum is so interesting, because back when she was in her 20s, 50 years earlier, she would go to that house to meet with Andrew Bevel, because that's where he would ask her to go much of the time, sometimes in his office, but other when she had to go to take notes too for this memoir that she was writing, going to be ghost writing for him. that really turned out to be ghostwriting, because then he dies. And what happens in that section that's so interesting towards the end, she is allowed to see, so the librarian who works in the museum gives her the document and she goes through everything, and she doesn't really find anything so interesting until she finds hidden away in one of the boxes in between the papers, Mildred's own journal, her own pages of her diary. And we see, so, that's when she, this Ida, now 70 years old, finds answers, or she thinks she found some answers to the mystery of who this Mildred was, what was going on here the whole time. What's her husband, the late Andrew Bevel, telling the young Ida the truth in his autobiography, the non-fiction version of the story that he was so angry about the fictionalized version that somebody had written. And then you get to the, and she ends this at when the end of her section is Ida, and she says, so she's skimming the letters. And she just finds it at the very end. She's skimming through the letters, and then she finds this slim notebook wedged into the middle section of one of the ledgers. And on the cover, in Mildred's hand, is the word futures. The first few sheets have been ripped out. The remaining pages contain short paragraphs and isolated lines in purple ink, different times of day, followed by text. He says, then Ida does something. She says, I am shocked at myself as I hide the journal among my papers and pack it into my bag. The only other time that I can think of when I took something, so she stole the papers from the library, is when I took a piece of Mildred's blotting paper from her room when I, back 50 years earlier, surreptitiously went on a tour of the mansion because I was not supposed to be allowed into Mildred's room. That's the one thing that Andrew, Mr. Bevel, had said to me. You can't go into Mildred's room. And she somehow got the housekeeper to let her in, and she takes this piece of blotting paper 50 years ago. So now, almost 50 years later, he takes the pages from the journal that she's never seen before. This is the second time I'm stealing Mildred's writing, almost a half a century later. I wonder vaguely if the blotting paper will match some page in the journal. But this is not theft, I tell myself. This is a conversation starting after a decades-long delay, a message finally arriving at its destination. These pages have been waiting a lifetime to be read, if they can be read. Still, I'm bothered by my arrogance, the feeling that the words in there are addressed to me. I'm bothered by how easy it is to convince myself that I have a right to this notebook. Who knows Mildred better than I? Didn't I even forge her a pass out of my own? Are we not then in some oblique way connected? I am bothered by my certainty that Mildred would have liked to have this paper. And yet, I get up, thank the librarians, and walk out of the building and into the cold with Mildred Bevel's diary in my bag, thinking how lovely it would be to finally hear her voice. And her last section is her voice. This little bit that's left in the book called Futures is her voice. And that's where we get the kind of discovery or the reveal, the truth of what happened. In the brief, maybe, it's true. Do we know? Who do we trust? This is the fourth voice. So you have the male novelist, the male, then the character about whom the novel was written, and the two women. You have the very talented young, the young writer, you meet her as an older woman, and then you finally have Mildred's voice. And what's the, you read the book, right? So, oh, you read half of it.
I'm looking forward to the end.
Okay, so now I don't, it's not very familiar to you?
I know the whole story.
Oh, so you did read it then, okay.
You know what? I must say that when he was- And then he'll come out.
23, I think,
It must have been.
or 22. 22, I think 22, and it was very popular, and it was, so I don't know what to do about the
ending.
the ending. Did you read it? Have you read it?
I have not.
No.
Mine, it doesn't matter.
I think, okay, the people who have not read it, tell us now. Or forever hold your peace.
Oh, do you mind?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's true, you know what, because it's not, well, it's a whodunit in a way, but not, you know, it's not. I was gonna say it's not even a murder mystery, but you know, maybe it is. We can argue. All right, so I mean, maybe it's gonna mean nothing to you or making a bigger deal out of it than it is. But what are the little, it takes a while to figure that part out too. I don't know what you read it, right? You, the two of you, have you read it? No. So at the end, it's very short. And it's these little cryptic bits, and she's writing from the sanatorium, and she's writing, and it's not, if you wonder, was she mentally ill, or was it, and it seems, no, it seems it was a physical illness, at least that's what comes out in her journal pages. But what also comes out, and that's kind of, you know, one of the things he's very much trying to say, the author, these women's voices, were kept down and kept quiet, and it's really a very feminist book. It's an anti, you know, when it's something comes in, very anti-capitalist, it seems, what that's the author's feeling. And very, you know, the women didn't have their own voices back in the day. And so it seems like what you could figure is that Mildred, in these cryptic little, and it's also very disjointed pieces. There are some paragraphs, and then and it ends in very, like, kind of, you know, even physically, it looks like the poetry are just, you know, bits and pieces of words that, sorry, snippets, very much snippets. But these musical notations, musical notes like D, E, F sharp, or flat, or so. What it seems to be is that Mildred was brilliant. I mean, she's described as brilliant both in the novel and by her husband, except in the husband. He describes her as very intelligent, but he doesn't really give her, at least that's what it seems like by the time we come to the end, her due. And what comes out, at least to me, in the last part, is that Mildred was the one who was the genius. She understood invest. And she, because she was a mathematician, she's described even in the fiction part as having these uncanny abilities, memorizing and learning and reciting passages backwards and forwards, and you know, remember that part? But she understood the market, and she was the one, at least according to her journal, who gave Andrew advice and told him the markets and understood the patterns of the market. And it was all due to her that the family wealth grew and expanded. And so, but she gets no due. And but then the question, and then there's so many questions, but then it ends. So there you have the 4 different voices telling 4 different perspectives of the story. And who was Harold Banner? Did you, so I looked for it because, so it turns out, at least from what I could figure out, that he's mentioned a few times that he was on the guest list of Andrew and Mildred Bevel when she was still well enough to have dinner party. He was often invited to their house to dinner. He was apparently he had some correspondence with her when she was in the sanatorium in Switzerland. So he was a real, maybe a hanger-on or a wannabe of it, who knew the Bevels and was invited to their house for the times that they entertained. And he wrote a novel like these, you know, I mean, I guess this doesn't happen that infrequently where people write stories about, you know, people who know famous people or wealthy people, and they'll either write or they'll pass it off as fiction, but readers, avid for gossip, always will read it about whatever, you know, bigger people are interested in. But in this case, that seems to be, those of you who read it, like the clincher that it was Mildred and her voice was suppressed. And you know what was very interesting also, I looked up, so he had so many influences in this book. Edith Wharton, if anybody's read Edith Wharton, you know, her novels of the Gilded Age, New York society at the turn of the, you know, late 19th, early 20th century, she was an influence, and he said in interviews, these were the influences on my writing. Henry James and his short stories, Thomas Mann and his Magic Mountain, but the Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald is a very interesting one. I know I'm a little bit over, but I remember when I was a teenager, I was fascinated with Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. I read some of The Great Gatsby. So The Great Gatsby, you know, you read this book and you think, oh, the Roaring '20s and Wealth and Gatsby and Fitzgerald. And Zelda, I remember reading about Zelda and remembering that, thinking that she was quite a personality. She even wrote a novel of her own. But what was her story? So I went back and just looked her up. She was born in 1900. She died tragically in a fire in a mental institution, or as they used to call them, asylums for the, you know, mentally insane. In the South, she was a Southern belle, born into this wealthy, well-connected Southern family in Montgomery, Alabama. And she married Scott Fitzgerald when she was a mere, I think 20, but she met him when she was 17 years old. He was a character. She was a rebel. She was a wild girl. Remember, back in she graduated high school in 1917, and that's when she met Scott Fitzgerald, was a young soldier stationed nearby, and he met her at a dance and fell in love with her and wanted to marry her right away, but she wasn't interested in getting married. She married him in 1920, when she was all 20 years old. And the two of them became this celebrity couple. He became a writer, but he struggled at the beginning. And then they lived this life. They went to Europe. They lived in Paris. You know, I don't know if anybody read Zelda. There were biographies written about her. And she was really, and then she decided she wanted to become a ballet dancer. And for many years, she tried to be a dancer. And then she descended, or maybe that's the wrong word. She always had. So how would you diagnose it today? Apparently, there are debates whether it would be bipolar disorder or it sounded like bipolar with her mania and her burst of energy and then her depressive state. And she ended up, she was sent to Switzerland to a sanatorium there to be taken.
But apparently it was voluntary. It was like voluntary. She checked herself into mental institutions. Yeah, apparently they were recurring, she would and she would voluntarily go, which is not what we expect, right? That people would be, but no, she would like sign up to be put into an asylum.
Because she realized that her brain was racing and
I guess, yeah.
Because the Mildred in the,
it's not.
No, sorry, not the Mildred, the
Zelda.
Just one in the first part, Helen, yes. She also, her mind is racing, and she writes about that racing mind. And so, so Zelda Fitzgerald is so much in that character. And then, I mean, in the end, as I said, sadly, Zelda, she descended into this, like, that's where she spent. Her mother took care of her, and then she died. There was a fire in the hospital. And she was, from what I read, she was waiting for a shock treatment, and she was walked into a room, and there was a fire in the kitchen, and the whole place burned down. And she was among many women died. It was for women that. So the whole story it's fascinating. I mean, those of you who, I don't know, I would say read it. It's odd just because of the 4 parts. If you have the patience, I mean, not patience, it doesn't take that much patience. It's not that long. Yes.
Even the word trust.
Okay, sorry, I didn't even get to that.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. So that's it. So the whole title, which is trust, is a financial term. But you know, a trust. So, but as our bonds and as our futures, it's a play on words. And he said, yes, trust is the author, is a financial term. But he said also, there's also a trust between the reader and the author of any book. Because you start to read a book and you trust, I mean, you're reading it, do you believe the author's words? Do you not? There's a sense of trust. So he said he was playing on that. And also the trust, so there are all kinds of the characters, the different, the idea of trust between people. And the trust we place in each other, as well as he wants to emphasize the contract between the reader and the writer. That the writer, I guess he as a writer feels, he has a, if a reader just by opening the author's book and starting to read, I guess there's a kind of contract, not that you're signing anything that you're going to finish the book, but there is a certain sense. So that's what he said he does here. He says, he says, this book is about the gravitational pull of money. And he said, I was particularly fascinated in the iconic era of the 20s and the 30s, where there was all this mythologizing about money. And also he wanted to point out, which I said, that the narratives then were all about men, that women were not really part. In fact, I think it was 1967 was the first year that a woman was allowed to hold a seat on the stock exchange, which was relatively recently. But he said, so he wanted to pervert the stereotypes. He wanted to flip the roles, and that's why he told the story from both female and male perspectives. That he said, usually the women were wives or secretaries or victims. And in this case, so the Helen or the Mildred, what was she? A victim? Ida starts out as a secretary and then is no longer a secretary. Who was Mildred a victim of her husband? Was Mildred? Anyway, it's quite the, I guess you could say, tour de force and interesting. Whether I argue Pulitzer Prize winning, I'm not a judge of Pulitzer Prize giving, but it won. It did. Actually, the other lady who was there said that apparently it shared it with Demon Kaufman, Barbara Kingsolver's very, very long novel that poverty and addiction and anyway, those two that year won the Pulitzer Prize together. So yes, it did.
I mean, putting in just the notations of what an author wants to complete and leaving that as part of the whole
right. So that is,
I don't think we've seen that.
Different voices of postmodern style. I don't know what I mean.
Yeah, postmodern, I think makes sense, maybe.
Yeah. But
like disjointed, I guess.
Disjointed bits and pieces. That makes sense because either it was
makes sense. It all makes sense.
It all makes sense, yeah. But it's such that especially at that bit at the end, she steals the paper, she tries to decipher what's going on, these musical notations, which turn out to be also hints at how, and she tells her husband, and then every night, like she'll tell him, okay, so mathematics, and she was brilliant at mathematics, and mathematics is very much part of the way the markets work and predicting trends. So anyway, very, very interesting. A lot to talk about. He's saying a lot. He's saying a lot. And as they say, he has a very definite opinions about capitalism and women's roles and his whole use of language, which just to me, the idea that this is his third language and he's writing it, that is really something. Yeah. It's interesting, no? Like he would be writing in Spanish still if he did already his college work.
He wouldn't be writing in Spanish. That's another time when we're never educated and it's not.
But he went like his first university degree was in Spanish. They went back to Buenos Aires.
Oh,
That's what he said. Yeah. I know. It's like, okay, no, it wasn't, but he did it. He did literature in Spanish, he did, but obviously, but he said he fell in love with English and you couldn't write a book about America at this time in any other language. That doesn't make sense. So I don't know if this has inspired me to go ahead and read it or not. But we'll see.
You can compare it to Demon Copperhead if you can.
Oh.
So May 15th is our next one, back to 2 o'clock, folks.
Yeah, back to.
I want to book again.
It's Anne Patchett.
Anybody ever was ever reading Our Town by Thornton Wilder, years ago? It was the play, yeah, okay, for